My name is Eric Gaskell, and you're listening to the Distorted History Podcast.
To speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
I can give you merry tales and joyous laughter.
Shameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror.
A long struggle for freedom.
It really is a revolution.
Elizabeth Packard had spoken her mind. In doing so, she had disagreed with her husband, the pastor Theophilus Packard. For this crime, he had his wife declared insane and sent away to the state psychiatric hospital in Jacksonville, Illinois. After 2 years in said asylum, there appeared to be some light at the end of the long dark tunnel for Elizabeth. She had spoken to the trustees, the men who had final say over who was and was not released from the asylum in September 1862, and they had apparently been so impressed with her that they agreed to revisit the topic of her release when they next met in December of that year. In the intervening time, Elizabeth had gone to work on a book that she hoped to have published that would not only tell her story, but would act as proof of her sane mind. However, come December, the trustees, after meeting with her husband, had come to the decision to postpone her release indefinitely, thereby shattering Elizabeth's hopes of getting out and returning to her beloved children. Elizabeth Packard, however, was not deterred. She was as determined as ever to get out of those walls, prove her sanity, and return to her children. Yet before we resume the story of how she would pursue those goals, first, like always, I want to give credit to my sources, which primarily are Kate Moore's excellent The Woman They Could Not Silence, Barbara Sip Inslee's The Private War of Mrs. Packard, and Jeffrey L. Geller and Maxine Harris's Women of the Asylum, Voices from Behind the Wall 1840 to 1945. And like always, these and any additional sources like websites that I used in putting these episodes together will be listed on this podcast Twitter and Ko-fi pages, links to which are in the description. And with all that being said, let's begin. Elizabeth had finished her book that she had taken to calling The Great Drama, a tome that she felt had it been published before the trustees' meeting like Dr. McFarland had promised her he would do, the resulting public pressure would have been enough to guarantee her freedom. To be clear, this wasn't just a wild fancy or a beautiful dream, as when Elizabeth had shared her work with the other women in the hospital, including her fellow patients and the employees she was friendly with, it quickly became the talk of the asylum. One of the women most impressed by this was Sophie Olsen, whose testimony about the abuses taking place in the hospital I referenced in the last episode. Sophia, you see, had been first brought to the asylum a couple months earlier, and had followed a path very similar to Elizabeth's own, in that she had started out in the 7th Ward but had since been sent to the 8th after speaking out against the repressive asylum rules. That also wasn't the end of the similarities between these two women either. You see, both had been raised in New England, and both had received first-class educations while there, following which they had both gotten married and subsequently been committed by their husbands. Yet, despite this personal injustice that had been done to them, both had chosen to focus on the larger issues they came face to face with in the asylum. Sophia, like Elizabeth, was even keeping her own secret diary. It would actually be due to Sophia that Elizabeth started to sense that Dr. McFarland had not changed like she thought he had. Things seemingly started when one day Sophia went to speak with Elizabeth, only to be stopped by one of the attendants. Indeed, within weeks of their meeting and starting to bond, Sophia would be labeled as an unmanageable mischief maker and would subsequently be banished to the 5th Ward. The two women would not see each other for some time, until they unexpectedly encountered one another in November 1862. Both were overjoyed to see the other, but both knew better than to show emotion, knowing that such displays were potential ground for punishment and would likely only result in their being separated again. So, instead of outward displays of emotion, the pair opted to sit down together in the dining hall to converse quietly, hoping to not draw the attention of any attendants. During which time Sophia told Elizabeth all about how the hospital's 5th Ward, which she had been sent to, was a, quote, charnel house of human woe. The 5th Ward, you see, was located in the bottom of the hospital, a location that was seemingly designed as if to crush the spirits of its unfortunate residents. The ward, for some reason, had abnormally low ceilings, giving the entire place a claustrophobic feeling. Meanwhile, many of its rooms only had half doors, as the top half of the doorway was blocked with iron bars, denying the women inside any kind of privacy and giving the place even more of an air of a prison. Additionally, much like the 8th ward had been when Elizabeth had first arrived, the 5th ward and its patients were both filthy. Additionally, for whatever reason, books were completely banned from the ward. Worse still, though, was the fact that the patients therein were covered in bruises from the hateful and abusive Lizzie Bonner, the same woman that Elizabeth and her friends the Coes had complained about. As it turns out, Lizzie had not been fired nor apparently disciplined in any way. Instead, she had been let loose in the 5th ward, where she was just as violent and cruel as ever, a fact that Dr. McFarlane seemed cognizant of, as when Sophia had spoken up to Bonner, the attendant had informed her that she had been instructed by the doctor to manage the patients as she saw fit. All of this was alarming to Elizabeth. She had honestly begun to believe that Dr. McFarlane had reformed. She had believed/hoped he had changed to become a kinder, gentler, and more empathetic superintendent. That being said, Elizabeth was not unprepared for this revelation. You see, while she had been working on her grand drama, the book that McFarlane was fully aware of, she had also begun work on a second book, which she had kept secret from the doctor. A book that she hoped she would not need to publish. A book designed to expose all the horror she had seen in the asylum, while also exposing McFarlane's complicity in these offenses. A book she would not need to publish and damage his reputation with if he was truly as repentant as she hoped him to be, and had thus improved the conditions in the asylum. However, the warning signs about McFarlane's true nature continued to mount, as further restrictions were suddenly placed upon Elizabeth, as she was suddenly forbidden from sharing her book with the other patients. This was because, in McFarlane's estimation, Elizabeth was having a negative impact on his other patients, what with all her talks of rights and whatnot. McFarlane then clearly hadn't changed. She had simply been misled by the fact that he had started treating her differently. At the same time, he had also started isolating her from other rebellious patients like Sophia. Meanwhile, due to her well-earned reputation as a troublemaker, the various attendants knew they had to act a certain way around Elizabeth lest she protest and cause a stir, all of which gave her a false impression that things had changed, when the reality was things were just as bad as they always had been. It was just now these things were happening where she didn't see or hear about it personally. As such, Elizabeth did not realize that the beatings the patients suffered at the hands of the attendants had, if anything, picked up in brutality. Elizabeth, however, would one day be confronted by just how little things had changed or improved in the asylum, even if things in her immediate vicinity had. Elizabeth was sitting in the mess hall when she happened to take note of a thin woman with an extreme look of desperation in her eyes, a look far too common on the patients who were not being helped at all by being held in the asylum. Patients who, due to all the oppression, all the beatings, and all the forced isolation in small dark rooms, were breaking under the pressure. As Elizabeth watched stunned, this woman picked up a knife and raised it to her own neck. The next thing Elizabeth knew, blood was bursting forth as this harried woman started slicing her own throat. Now, this wound was not severe enough to end her life. Instead, the woman was bandaged and trussed up in a straitjacket and subsequently placed in solitary confinement, which I'm sure was a great benefit to this poor woman's state of mind. So, things had not changed. The asylum staff and its punishments were as cruel and brutal as ever. In fact, the asylum would also around this time implement even stricter rules prohibiting visitors and not allowing patients to go out on walks around its spacious grounds. Yet, while Elizabeth had not convinced Dr. McFarlane or much of his staff to change their ways, she did have an impact, as she had inspired the other patients to resist and fight back. Sophia and the women of her ward who were suffering under the brutal reign of Lizzie Bonner quietly started banding together as they tried to come up with some kind of plan to convince the asylum to create a kinder, less violent environment. Eventually, Sophia and her allies came upon the idea of forming a kind of patient protest that centered around destroying the asylum property. Among other forms of mischief, the women tore up blankets, clothing, and curtains. They smashed doors, opened up cushions, discreetly tossed silverware out open windows, and smashed glasses and various crockery in time with the loud ringing of the asylum's bell so as to hide their activities. In all, this destructive campaign cost the asylum hundreds of dollars worth of damages. It was effective, though, as it led to a bit of a loosening of the reins, as visits were allowed again and patients were once again permitted to go on walks. Yet still, McFarlane continued to ignore the patients and their reports of abuses. Plus, he also did not seem to be in a rush to get the first volume of Elizabeth's book published, with the book being the one hope she clung on to as being the best chance she had of getting out of there. After all, it's not like she had anyone else to turn to, isolated as she was by the doctor's actions, as he ensured she received no communications from her friends back in Menteno, nor from her eldest son Theo. Elizabeth then was convinced that the only way she was likely to get out of the asylum was if she could get her book published and thereby generate enough public pressure to get her release. For that to happen, though, she needed help, and the only potential for such help came in the unlikely form of Dr. McFarland. Desperate, Elizabeth started penning a letter in which she made an offer of the only thing she had that she believed the doctor could actually want. So, despite the two of them being married, she offered him her heart. No more than that, mind you. Elizabeth was far too religious to even in her desperation make such an offer. Instead, she wrote, quote, "I love your spirit," adding as a way of clarification that she, quote, "must not love your person so long as that love is justly claimed by another woman, your legal wife." Essentially, she seemed to be offering him the love of her soul, seemingly with an eye towards some kind of union in the afterlife, asking in exchange his help now in having her book published. Additionally, she requested that once he was done reading the note, he must burn it. As for McFarland, after he read this missive, he said nothing. Instead, he simply offered Elizabeth his hand as he bowed to her, bending at the waist, a gesture that she assumed meant he accepted her offer. Yet still a month or so passed after this exchange, and still the good doctor continued not doing anything concerning having Elizabeth's book published, so that she might finally get out of the asylum. In response, Elizabeth wrote another letter to the doctor. This letter, however, unlike the last one, made no promises of some kind of loving bond between their souls. Instead, this missive actually recalled a different promise she had made back in 1860, following her first 4 months in the asylum, a letter she had penned following another time when he had seemingly ignored her pleas for assistance. In that letter, you might recall she had threatened McFarland that she had served witness to a number of horrors and abuses taking place within the asylum under his watch. She had then asserted that if he failed to help her and failed to reform his ways, she would expose him and his horror show of an asylum to the world. In this latest missive, then, Elizabeth made it clear that if he did not have her book published in a timely fashion, she was prepared to keep that promise she had made all those years ago, because she had secretly been working on a second book titled The Exposure, focusing on the abuses and cruelty that was rampant in the asylum. Now, the first time Elizabeth had made this threat, she had been cast out of the relatively comfortable 7th Ward and sent to the 8th, where she for the first time was really exposed to the asylum's true ugly face. So, as you might expect, Dr. McFarland was not exactly enthused to receive this threat again. Indeed, he would confront Elizabeth, informing her that he found her latest letter to be quite, quote, unladylike, due to the threat it contained. Elizabeth, however, was not about to apologize. She had sworn that she would expose him all that time ago if he refused to repent, and she was simply keeping to that. All McFarland had to do was publish her book, as he himself had promised he would do, while also making serious strides to improve the conditions in the asylum. If he followed such a course, there would be no need for Elizabeth to expose his wrongdoings, as in such a scenario, they would all be in the past. Yet, if he insisted on carrying on as he always had, well, he would give her no choice. As far as Elizabeth was concerned, if McFarland feared exposure, the choice was in his hands, not hers. Faced with this situation, McFarland reacted in much the same way he had before. Just instead of sending her to an even worse ward, he had Elizabeth locked away in one of the asylum's screen rooms, which effectively served as solitary confinement. That being said, she was only kept in said room for 2 hours, but the reason for this confinement became clear as soon as she returned to her room and saw that it and all of her belongings had been searched in her absence. It was obvious from the way all her belongings were scattered about that McFarland and or his lackeys had gone through her things looking for the dangerous second tome she claimed to have written outlining all the cruelty she had witnessed since coming to the asylum. Now, McFarland had not found her second tome nor her private journal in which she had taken detailed notes on everything she had witnessed during her stay. He did, however, seize the one manuscript he did know about, the one she was trying to get him to publish in the hopes that it would aid in her release. That being said, within a few weeks' time, McFarland would return the manuscript to her, as he seemingly resumed his Mr. Nice Guy act. Meanwhile, Elizabeth found herself faced with another potentially even more dangerous threat, when she received a warning from her cousin Angeline. Angeline had actually spent a good chunk of her childhood being raised alongside Elizabeth, so the two were more like sisters than cousins. As a result, Elizabeth fully trusted Angeline when she warned her that her good-for-nothing husband Theophilus, upon learning of Dr. McFarland recommending her release, had begun searching for a more compliant asylum that might take her in and potentially never let her out again. Apparently, according to Angeline, Theophilus had found what he was looking for in the state lunatic hospital in Northampton, Massachusetts, an asylum that prided itself on never turning away patients, and which, perhaps even more importantly, had a friend of Theophilus's on the board of trustees, the body of men who would have final say on whether or not Elizabeth would ever get out. Upon receiving this news, Elizabeth now feared that if she was released without some kind of protection from her husband, Theophilus was going to simply have her re-institutionalized. As such, when the Jacksonville trustees finally decided in March 1863 to release Elizabeth, this decision was not met with the kind of joy you might expect from the woman herself. Indeed, when they set a release date for June instead of April, it felt like they were doing so simply to give her husband time to get his ducks in a row, so that upon Elizabeth's release he could have her immediately locked up in the state lunatic asylum in Northampton, Massachusetts. Now, to be clear, this does not appear to be a case of the trustees actually coming to the conclusion that Elizabeth was sane and had no business being locked away in their asylum. Instead, if anything, it seems to be an acknowledgement of the reality that in March 1863, Elizabeth's oldest son Theo became 21. As such, he had the ability to legally insist they release his mother into his care. For Elizabeth, though, this mattered far less than the threat of her husband and another asylum waiting for her in the future. She desperately needed some form of protection to save her from such a fate, protection that Elizabeth felt her bulk might just provide. As such, she just needed someplace safe to stay while she worked on getting it published. To that end, she actually asked Dr. McFarland if she might be allowed to remain in the hospital for a while longer to finish work on her book safe from her husband. Following this request, Elizabeth no longer saw herself as a patient but as a boarder of sorts who was simply renting a room in the hospital for a short time. Yet still the months went by, and come June her manuscript still had not been published, but her husband would unfortunately arrive regardless. Indeed, on the 18th of June 1863, Elizabeth was suddenly informed that she had to be dressed and ready to depart by 9 a.m. that morning. Elizabeth, fearing what he might have in store for her, protested the very idea of being put in the control of her husband again, as she did not trust the man in the least. However, the protection she had believed she had gotten from McFarland when he seemingly agreed to let her stay on as a boarder vanished like a puff of smoke. Proof again that despite her hopes otherwise, McFarland had not changed or repented in any way. So, once again, Elizabeth found herself carried bodily out of her room much like she had when being brought there close to 3 years earlier. She was then escorted out of the asylum to where her quote-unquote husband Theophilus was waiting beside a carriage, while inside the hospital a number of the women who had gotten to know her held a wake of sorts as they feared what was going to happen to her now. As for Elizabeth, she boarded a train with her husband, bound for a destination she did not know, nor would she ask Theophilus where he was taking her, as she refused to say a single word to him. For his part, Theophilus would not try to actively engage with her, although he would move to adjust her shawl when it slipped out of place, and would pay for the lemonade she ordered during the trip. So when they reached their apparent destination, Elizabeth still had no idea where they were, but she also had really no other choice but to accompany her husband, as it's not like she could run away and ask for help. Doing so would only make her look insane, and he was her husband, which meant, by law, he pretty much could do what he wished with her. Plus, it's not like she had any money to go anywhere with. She was then very much beyond shocked when she stepped off the train into the welcoming arms of her cousin, who had been raised more as her sister Angeline and Angeline's husband David. Theophilus, as it turns out, had brought her to their home in Greenville, Illinois. Elizabeth then was finally in the company of people she both loved and trusted, and who loved and trusted her in return. Such an act was seemingly out of character for the loathsome, petty little tyrant, but soon enough Theophilus revealed the true motivation behind this apparent act of kindness. You see, Elizabeth was to stay here with her cousin, free of the asylum, as long as she never returned to see her children, with the warning being that if she did attempt to see her darling children, Theophilus would put her in another asylum. This was a heartbreaking turn of events for Elizabeth. The joy she had felt upon getting out of the asylum and being reunited with Angeline, who was like a sister to her, had been ripped away the moment she was informed she could never see her children she cared so much for and missed so deeply. It also wasn't just her own plight that Elizabeth was concerned with either, as she was deeply bothered by the knowledge of all those women still wrongly locked up in the asylum, and also for those women who, even if they did actually suffer from some mental malady that might require treatment, all they seemingly got instead was abuse from the cruel and uncaring members of the hospital staff. Elizabeth worried for the safety of these women, as while she was in the hospital with them, she had been able to at least try and intervene on their behalf. She feared then that there would be no one there looking out for them and their safety, as certainly Dr. McFarland had no interest in protecting his patients from abuse. Elizabeth, however, soon came to the realization that even though she was no longer there to help them, there was something she could do. So she started writing letters to the families of the women she had come to know while in the institution to inform them of what was really taking place behind the asylum's carefully maintained facade. Among those who were helped by Elizabeth's letter-writing campaign was none other than her friend Sophia Olson, whose brother, upon learning about the abuses his sister was suffering, fought for 6 months to have her released into his care. Sophia then, thanks to Elizabeth and her brother, would escape from Dr. McFarland's crutches and live the life of an artist who painted maps for a living. Additionally, Elizabeth also continued to pursue having her book published, believing that once it was released and caused enough of a stir, laws would be changed and she would finally have protection against her cruel husband and would finally be able to see her children again. Yet publisher after publisher refused to reprint her work, due to the fact that it had been written by a person who had been a patient in an insane asylum. Yet, even as Elizabeth was finding more barriers placed in her path, she continued to be vindicated in her belief that when people learned of the full scope of what had happened to her, they would be outraged. Indeed, as she shared her story with her new neighbors in Granville, by the end of the summer they held a public indignation meeting in response to what Theophilus had done to her, and in response to his latest insistence that she never be allowed to see her children again. The people of Granville, it seemed, agreed that it was outrageous that this woman, who they all agreed was clearly sane, had not only been locked up in an asylum, but was also now being denied the opportunity to see her own children. It wasn't just words either, as the people of Granville actually raised money so Elizabeth, who, mind you, had no money of her own at this point, could pay for a train fare to go see her children, with anything over and above the cost of a ticket to go to whatever legal defense she required against her husband. Elizabeth, who was beyond grateful for this, would however have one final request for the people of Granville, that being their help in publishing a pamphlet that she hoped would help to elicit more public sympathy, a request the people of Granville readily agreed to. Using $10 of the money raised by the good people of Granville, Elizabeth then printed up 1,000 copies of her pamphlet, which primarily consisted of Elizabeth's appeal on behalf of the insane that she had tried to get published in newspapers but had never actually appeared, likely due to coverage of the ongoing Civil War. She then sold these pamphlets for 10 cents each through the post office, thereby earning her own money for probably the first time since her marriage. It was at this point then that Elizabeth began making plans to return to Manteno and her children. As she did so, Elizabeth was understandably worried and afraid of what Theophilus might do, not to mention what he had already done to ruin her reputation with the goal of alienating her from her friends and her children. Yet, as anyone who has been paying attention would expect, Elizabeth was not the type to be intimidated, especially not where her children were concerned. She'd been separated from them for too long already, and could not stand remaining so for any longer. Indeed, she would describe the situation by writing, quote, "The pain is unutterable, unspeakable." So, in October 1863, about 4 months since she had been released from the asylum, Elizabeth purchased a ticket and boarded a train bound for Manteno. She had, by this point, been separated from her children for 3.5 years, and it was well past time to change that. Elizabeth would arrive in Manteno unannounced, so in stark contrast to her departure over 3 years earlier, the station was more or less abandoned when she arrived. As Elizabeth started making her way toward her old home, she was struck by the sudden fear that her husband could potentially, by law, seize the trunk that she left at the station, wherein, along with her meager belongings, was her prized manuscript. Fearing the loss of her hard work that she hoped once published would be a shield from her husband, Elizabeth moved to return to the station to speak with the station master and convince him to keep her trunk safe. As she turned to head back, however, Elizabeth found a young boy with a cap pulled low over his face standing in her path. Seeing this as an opportunity to save her the trip, Elizabeth asked the young man if he might go back to the station to ask the station master to make sure a Mr. Packard did not try and take her trunk. A fairly simple request, so Elizabeth was surprised to find this boy oddly resistant. She could not figure out why he would be so unwilling to do this for her until the boy announced that he didn't want to say anything against his pa. It was at this point that Elizabeth realized that this had to be her little George. She had not recognized him at first, what with his cap being pulled so low, and because he had changed so much in the 3.5 years she had been away. He had just been 6 years old the last time she had seen him, and here he was a 10-year-old. Elizabeth then moved to embrace George, overjoyed at the sight of one of her children after so long. It was obvious, though, that George was torn. After all, for 3.5 years he had been raised solely by his father, who had that entire time to fill George and all the other children's heads with all manner of lies concerning their mother and her so-called condition. At the same time, though, he was also clearly happy to see her. As the scene was taking place and Elizabeth was sending her son on his way back home, seeing as how he could not help her in this instance, word of her return was filtering around town. As such, she soon encountered her old friend and ally Mr. Blessing, who promptly retrieved Elizabeth's trunk for her, bringing it back to he and his wife's home. This was yet another welcome encounter, as due to the complete isolation she had experienced in the asylum, Elizabeth had started to fear/assume she had been abandoned by all her friends. After all, she had been locked away in the asylum for years with no communication. Sure, she had suspected that McFarland had been censoring and withholding her mail, but she had no way to confirm or prove that until now, as she was informed by her friends that they had not abandoned her, but instead had been prevented from contacting her by both Dr. McFarland and Theophilus, who both insisted that she be completely isolated. In fact, her friends had even held a public indignation meeting shortly after her husband had essentially kidnapped Elizabeth and placed her in the asylum, something which infuriated her husband, as like always, he saw himself as the victim of unjust meddlers. Also, true to their word, Elizabeth's friends had conducted a letter-writing campaign to try and secure an actual hearing for her, in which she could challenge her husband's claims of insanity. Yet, as they found out, and as we have established, the law was very much on her husband's side in this matter. They even tried to get a hearing based upon a writ of habeas corpus, but unfortunately, again, such a legal procedure would only work if the imprisonment itself was in violation of the law, which hadn't been the case with Elizabeth, as she had been held in a state-approved asylum after being deemed insane by the word of her husband, all of which was, unfortunately, according to the law, perfectly legal. While catching up with the Blessings and some of her other friends over lunch at the Blessings' home, Elizabeth would also learn the full story of why her husband was no longer employed as a minister. You see, about 1.5 years before this, a significant number of his parishioners abandoned the church, rebelling against the old school creed the church had switched to and thus starting a new church, one that followed the new school creed their old church had followed until recently. Basically the same thing that Elizabeth had done that had ultimately led Theophilus to have her placed in the asylum. On that note, I should add, rumor also had it that a number of the parishioners left for no other reason than due to the way Theophilus had treated his wife. So, with fewer and fewer people coming to hear Theophilus preach, the church leaders then had little choice but to fire him from the position. So, basically, Elizabeth had been institutionalized to protect Theophilus's job and to keep the church from splitting. Yet, even with her gone, it all happened anyway, and potentially even happened because she had been sent away. Plus, keep in mind the whole reason why the church had switched to the old school creed was due to the whim of their wealthy benefactor who sought to preserve the Union by silencing all that troublesome talk of abolition. Another plan that seemed to be working out very well in 1863, what with the massive Civil War and all. Bolstered somewhat by this news and from the support of her friends, Elizabeth handed off her prized manuscript to her friend Sarah Hazlitt for safekeeping, as this way Elizabeth could be sure her husband wouldn't be able to get his hands on her work and destroy it. Elizabeth Packard then at long last returned home, which as expected was not in great shape, which was a tremendous change from the state it had been in when she had left. Elizabeth, you see, had always kept an immaculate home, as she threw herself fully into the duties of being a cook, cleaner, mother, and whatever else. Without her there, though, the home she returned to was now in an extremely disheveled state, As predictably, the care of a house and all its residents had simply been too much to thrust on the then 11-year-old shoulders of her daughter Libby, who had likely done her best given these circumstances, but it was simply too much for a young lady to handle all by herself. Upon re-entering her home for the first time in over 3 years, the first person that Elizabeth would see was none other than her quote-unquote husband Theophilus, who was sitting among a scattering of papers in the kitchen. Elizabeth, however, could not care less about him. Instead, her entire focus was on the 5-year-old boy who was also in the room. She immediately then moved to pick up little Arthur, who had been little more than a baby when she had been taken away. Then, as she was fussing over her youngest son, 2 of her other children appeared in the kitchen. Both George and Libby ran in and embraced their mother, who they had not seen in years. Elizabeth embraced them as well, while promising that they had their mother back and hopefully they would never be separated again. Turning her attention to Libby in particular, who at 14 rankled somewhat at being called her little daughter, Elizabeth asked if she wasn't happy that she could now be relieved of her duties around the house. Leave it to Theophilus to then interrupt this happy little scene as he barked out sourly in response, quote, "You aren't welcome here. We get along better without you." A statement which was a clear and obvious lie, considering that the entire home seemed to be covered in a layer of dirt. Elizabeth would then simply ignore her husband as the following day she set to work getting the house in order. Work that she had to do alone, as not only did Theophilus immediately fire the girl Elizabeth had hired to help her, but he also made sure to forbid the children from helping their mother. Indeed, he would not even allow Elizabeth to warm a pot of water so as to clean the walls, declaring, quote, "You shall heat no water upon my stove." Still, despite these attempts to sabotage her, Elizabeth continued her efforts to clean every square inch of the house, which included things like scrubbing the walls and the floors and cleaning and airing out the feather beds. That being said, Elizabeth would be prevented from doing something as simple as changing the sheets, as Theophilus had locked all the linen behind a closed door, along with Elizabeth's finer and warmer clothes that he for some reason continued to refuse to give her access to. He even interfered when she attempted to improve their children's habits of grooming and cleanliness, which had all clearly and obviously slipped without her there. Yet still he insisted on repeating the same lies he had told the children for the past 3 years. Their mother was insane and thus everything she said should be ignored. Now Elizabeth was allowed to instruct her children as a teacher, but other than that they were told to ignore all her parenting instructions concerning things like bedtime, bathing, and keeping their clothes clean and neat. And indeed, after being told the same lie over and over again for years, the children largely seemed to remain under their father's sway. As all this was happening, and the Packard household was clearly transformed into a cleaner, more well-maintained home, Elizabeth also continued to reconnect with her friends and others in the local community, who all couldn't help but note how not insane she seemed. Indeed, the only people who seemed to hold on to her husband's lies were his friends, who potentially continued to think Elizabeth insane because she refused to give them the time of day, as who wouldn't want to spend time and chat with people who treated you like you were insane and had more than likely played a hand in getting you locked away in an asylum for 3+ years. This was also, by the way, the same tack that Elizabeth took with her husband. She would not fight, much less argue with him regardless of the provocation. Indeed, she pretty much refused to speak with him at all. For Theophilus, though, the most annoying thing about his wife's unwanted return was how all her friends and the various locals started making a big stink about how he was treating his wife. From his point of view, all these meddlesome busybodies were, quote, prejudicing and influencing the public mind against him. As again, Theophilus was always the victim in all things. He was not wrong in his behavior, and these people were not justifiably outraged by his past and ongoing actions. No, they were the ones cruelly and maliciously attempting to paint him as the villain for absolutely no reason. Yet, as bad as this was, what was really outrageous and totally unacceptable was when a set of keys to the house went missing. Theophilus was immediately convinced that Elizabeth must have stolen them, as with these keys she would have full freedom of every room in the house, including the room holding all the linens and her clothes. Plus, it would also allow her to come and go as she pleased from the home. Elizabeth then would have complete freedom, and that was certainly not something Theophilus could allow. Yet, despite having Elizabeth herself, her room, and all her belongings thoroughly searched, the keys in question remained missing. So Theophilus did as he'd done years earlier before he had her placed in the asylum. As he locked Elizabeth up in the nursery, he even once again boarded up the windows to the room to ensure that she was fully imprisoned in there, while also making sure that she was cut off completely from her friends, as he turned them away whenever they came to visit, something that Theophilus was all too happy to do, as their friends were a constant source of annoyance, what with them siding with Elizabeth against him and all. The loss of these keys was also seemingly the last piece of motivation that Theophilus needed to follow through on his threat of ridding himself of his troublesome wife for good. To that end, he started making preparations to have Elizabeth locked away in yet another asylum, one that she would not be getting out of this time around. Once again, then, all Theophilus needed to have his wife readmitted to another asylum without any kind of trial to determine her sanity was 2 simple notes from doctors. He even already had one such note from the very man who had released Elizabeth from the Jacksonville asylum in the first place. You see, what Elizabeth had not realized was McFarland had been working against her and aiding her husband the entire time. This even included when McFarland had recommended her release, as the reality was he had only done so because he did not want to have to deal with her any longer. He, however, still fully believed her insane, and so he looked to aid her husband by writing a certificate with the official seal of the Jacksonville Asylum, in which he asserted, quote, "Of the existence of her insanity I have no question." Indeed, he would note that he discharged her, quote, "not because the disease is cured or because any doubts has arisen as to its existence," meaning that despite choosing to release Elizabeth, he still very much firmly believed her to be insane. So Theophilus had one of the 2 letters from doctors that he required to have her locked away once again. All he needed then was one more. To that end, he invited Manteno physician James Mann to come over and examine Elizabeth. Yet, despite admitting that he was, based upon what Theophilus had told him, preconditioned to find Elizabeth insane, Mann could, quote, "find nothing that indicated insanity," an outcome that certainly did not please Mr. Packard, so he tried again, as it seemingly did not matter how many doctors might find someone sane, it only mattered that you could find 2 who agreed that person was insane. So Theophilus went doctor shopping, this time in nearby Kankakee, returning with one Dr. Joseph Way, who found Elizabeth to be, quote, "easily excited," and possessing of what he termed a, quote, "nervous temperament," which I'm sure had nothing to do with the whole threat of being separated from her children and put into an asylum again. Generally, though, Dr. Way did not find Elizabeth to be particularly insane until they got to talking about religion. Elizabeth, as you might have guessed from her past, had quite a bit to say about that particular subject, and Dr. Way found her passion for this topic and some of her beliefs to be quite strange. Thus, he proclaimed her insane, giving Theophilus his second certificate. Now Elizabeth could tell that her husband was up to something, what with these doctors' visits and all. Thus, she was quite suspicious when her husband invited yet another man in to speak with her. Now, Theophilus insisted this man was not a doctor. Instead, he was there to sell her on one of the new treadle-operated sewing machines he had to offer. Now, Elizabeth, an expert in having to sew clothes for her numerous children, saw the benefits and time-saving qualities of such a device. As the pair got to talking, however, they moved past speaking solely on the new sewing machines this man was here to sell. They would, for example, discuss the ongoing Civil War, with Elizabeth opining that the Confederate fight to continue the practice of slavery was at least somewhat akin to her husband's attempted despotism toward herself. She, however, became quite suspicious when the salesman turned the topic of conversation to religion, especially since he seemed to be particularly interested in her views on the matter, at which point Elizabeth became far less interested in engaging with this stranger, and even went so far as to refuse to shake his hand when he departed. Theophilus, meanwhile, was quite pleased with himself and his plan, which had almost come to fruition. It was only a matter of time before he could take Elizabeth to the asylum in Northampton, Massachusetts. Now, you may be thinking this was all too predictable of an outcome. Theophilus had made clear his intentions, and had already proven time and again exactly what kind of man he was. Clearly, such a petty tyrant could only stand being defied so openly for so long. Sooner or later, then, he was going to snap and follow the exact same script he had the first time he had Elizabeth sent away. As soon as she returned, it was only a matter of time before he imprisoned her in their home as a prelude to having her locked away in an asylum once and for all. He even, according to Elizabeth, took things a step further this time around as he started hitting Elizabeth and dragging her around by her hair. The thing is, Elizabeth was not at all surprised by any of what was happening. In fact, this was all more or less a part of her plan. She'd realized that Theophilus, just like McFarland, was essentially afraid of her for the same basic reason. Namely, she was simply too personable and charismatic. Traits, when combined with her determination not to be broken by either man, made her extremely dangerous. To that end, both men had attempted to restrict Elizabeth in every way possible, so as to prevent other people from siding with her due to her charisma and the fact that she really did not appear to be insane to the unbiased observer. Theophilus then, due to the fact that he could not control her and fearing that she might turn the surrounding populace to her side, predictably just like he had done before, locked her away in their home. The problem for Theophilus, as he would soon find out, was that while the law was on his side when it came to sending his wife away to an asylum without trial, he could not just lock someone up in his own home against their will. That's kinda illegal. Sure, Elizabeth could be locked up in the asylum for life, and that was perfectly legal, as the doctors there were legally empowered to hold people without consequence. Yet by locking his wife up in their home, Theophilus was unwittingly playing with fire. Something that would become obvious when at 10 a.m. on the 12th of January, a loud and insistent knock came from the front door of the Packard household. Upon opening the door, Theophilus was met by a court clerk carrying a writ of habeas corpus that read, quote, "We command you that the body of Elizabeth P.W. Packard in your custody, detained and imprisoned, be brought before Charles R. Starr, Judge." Theophilus, as always, was outraged at receiving this court order, blaming the quote-unquote interlopers for stirring up trouble again by making out that he was, quote, "falsely imprisoning her." There was, however, little he could do, as on top of the other outrages, he was only given 3 hours to bring Elizabeth to the courthouse. Rage as he might, Theophilus had no one else to blame but himself for this situation. He, after all, had been undone by his own cruelty and predictability. Elizabeth, after all, by this point, was well aware that trying to get the courts to step in and get her out of the asylum was all but impossible with the way the laws were written. So she had to do something before her husband could fully enact her plan of sending her away, potentially for good this time. So, now more aware of what exactly a writ of habeas corpus protected her against and what it didn't, Elizabeth decided the best way to get her case in the courts, and thereby potentially get legal protection from her husband, was to first get him to imprison her illegally. He, after all, had done it once already, so she was confident the petty little man could be prodded into doing so again. To that end, she had stolen the house keys and buried them in the ground outside, knowing that the missing keys would cause Theophilus to lose his mind and lock her up in the nursery just like he had before. It was then up to her friends to get a writ of habeas corpus filed, which as it turns out was quite a close-run thing, as they had not known just how close Theophilus was to pulling off his own plan. In fact, he was just days away when Elizabeth luckily happened to find letters detailing the date of her admittance in the Northampton asylum. With time running out far quicker than they expected, and with Elizabeth cut off, she needed a way to get this news out to her friends. Luckily, she had, through the cracks in the boards covering the nursery windows, taken note of a man who regularly passed by to retrieve water from a nearby pump. Knowing the man's schedule, Elizabeth managed to slip a letter through the boards and whisper to the stranger instructions to give the note to Mrs. Hazlitt. Thankfully, the stranger was kind-hearted and did as he was asked. Now, her friend's initial plan in response to this revelation was to break Elizabeth out and protect her in their home until they could get her to court. That, however, they feared would put them on the wrong side of the law and do them no favors in getting her case heard. Their next plan then was to have Elizabeth tear down the boards covering her windows and make a run for it. Elizabeth, however, rejected this idea as well, knowing that by destroying property, even simply smashing through boarded-up windows in an effort to escape her own unlawful imprisonment, she would quite likely be playing right into her husband's hands, as his lawyers and doctors would argue that only an insane person would destroy property. With Elizabeth rejecting their initial plans, her friends including Sarah and William Hazlitt, Zalman Hanford, Mantano's first town supervisor Daniel Breedy, and local merchant Joseph Youngblood all traveled to nearby Kankakee and its courthouse, where on the 11th of January 1864 they as responsible citizens asked one Judge Starr to file a writ of habeas corpus, as they asserted that Elizabeth Packard's husband was holding her in prison against her will. For evidence, Sarah Hazlitt reported to Judge Starr how she and others had attempted to see Elizabeth and had been denied access by Theophilus. It was then thanks to Sarah's testimony, which was backed by the several prominent men who had accompanied her, that the writ was finally issued. As while Theophilus, as Elizabeth's husband, still had the right to legally have her sent away to an insane asylum, he did not have the legal backing to lock her up in their home against her will. For Elizabeth, this was the moment she had long been waiting for. Where the law had failed her in the past, this writ of habeas corpus was set to finally give Elizabeth her day in court. Kankakee City, Illinois, which lay some 50 miles south of Chicago and had a population of 3,800 individuals who were mostly farmers, was most notably the county seat and home of the 20th Judicial Circuit Court, which was why that was where Theophilus was ordered to appear with his wife on the 12th of January 1864. Somewhat surprisingly, there was more than the normal amount of attention on this particular hearing, as Kankakee would see an influx of people from neighboring Manteno who wanted to see the courtroom drama play out. They weren't alone either, as a number of reporters from the region were also drawn to the story, as were a number of residents of Kankakee who had heard details like Elizabeth being named insane for no other reason than disagreeing with her husband on religious matters. This was notable for the people of Kankakee, as their town was the home of some 9 different churches. Therefore, the people there were used to others having differing opinions on religious matters and still managing to coexist. The idea then that someone would have someone else, their wife no less, declared insane and locked away over religious matters was quite upsetting. As Theophilus arrived at the court with Elizabeth, as he had been ordered to do, he was also notably accompanied by several lawyers, including his lead attorney, 36-year-old Thomas Bonfield. Now understand, this was a pretty significant gift for Theophilus, as Thomas Bonfield was one of Kankakee's first settlers and its first elected head, making him one of the community's most notable and most well-respected residents. Now, in contrast to Elizabeth's attorney, the 31-year-old Stephen Moore seemed to have been a much different character, as Moore, who was of Irish descent, was described as the life of any party. That being said, you would be mistaken to dismiss Moore out of hand, as he was also considered to be an exceptionally gifted attorney, a gifted attorney who was notably also known for his benevolence and charitable character. Indeed, he actually agreed to represent Elizabeth with no expectation of reward for his hard work, as remember, she really didn't have any money of her own. As the hearing got underway, Theophilus and his lawyers attempted to deny that he had illegally imprisoned and restrained his wife. At the same time, though, they also tried to argue the, quote, exercise of a slight necessary restraint over her on account of her insanity. Basically, it sounds like while trying to claim that the accusation of imprisonment was ludicrous, they also admitted to some light imprisonment for her own good because she was insane. To which Judge Starr responded by proclaiming, quote, prove it. It was then with these 2 simple words that Elizabeth would finally get the insanity trial she had so long desired, as Theophilus was now being forced to actually prove his claims that she was insane, which in turn also finally gave Elizabeth the chance to defend herself for the first time against these accusations. All of which, of course, outraged Theophilus and his legal team. This was supposed to be a habeas corpus case, and yet now, all of a sudden, it was turning into an insanity trial, which was bad enough, but married women were not even supposed to have insanity trials. Theophilus would rage impotently about how unfair and illegal all of this was. Indeed, he believed this was all the result of those unwanted meddlers and the mob mentality of the people gathered outside the courtroom who were influencing the judge to start these outrageously illegal proceedings. Yet, rage as he might about how unfair all of this was, the trial would still happen. As for Elizabeth, she was at least temporarily freed from her husband's clutches. As a result, over the course of the trial, Elizabeth would live with her friends J.W. Orr and his wife, who notably helped Elizabeth by loaning her some clothes so she would look properly presentable while in court, with Elizabeth not wanting her threadbare attire to be used as a sign of ill mind, and with Theophilus continuing to hold on to his wife's finer clothes. As the trial to determine Elizabeth's sanity got underway, Theophilus's team, despite not expecting this particular turn of events, were not exactly unprepared either. Theophilus had, after all, been gathering documents attesting to his wife's insanity for years in his efforts to have her locked away and to defend himself against anyone objecting to treating his wife in such a manner. So they called their first witness, a Dr. Christopher Knott, who was the man who had issued the certificate that had led to Elizabeth being committed back in 1860. On the stand then, Knott spoke of the pair of half-hour visits he made to the Packard household, which had led him to conclude that she was, quote, partially deranged on religious matters. All in all, then, this seemed fairly above board. This was a medical professional giving his educated opinion. Things, however, for Dr. Knott began to unravel during cross-examination, during which time Knott declared that Elizabeth was a quote-unquote monomaniac, which he would define as meaning, quote, insanity on one subject. It was at this point, though, that Knott really stepped in it, as he proclaimed that, quote, 3/4 of the religious community are insane in the same manner in my opinion. which was one heck of a declaration. Now, I'm no religious person myself, but I'm not going to sit here and declare that 3/4 of all religious people are crazy, and I'm especially not going to do it when I'm in a courtroom that was likely filled with a number of people who were themselves religious. Plus, if that was the case, why did Elizabeth need to be locked away when so many others suffered from the same issue? It was then at this point that, perhaps sensing he had misstepped, Dr. Knott added that, quote, her insanity was such that with a little rest she could have readily recovered from it. Which again really did not support Theophilus's case, or justify in the least why she had been locked away for 3 years, much less his current attempt to lock her away this time for good. So Theophilus's team tried again, this time calling Dr. J.W. Brown to the stand, with Dr. Brown being none other than the supposed sewing machine salesman who Theophilus had just allowed to visit and speak with Elizabeth during her confinement. As he took the stand, Dr. Brown would describe his time meeting with Elizabeth before Christmas, before wrapping up by proudly declaring his conclusion that she was unquestionably insane. The thing was, Brown had the distinct habit of using large ungainly words in what seems to have been an apparent attempt to show off his so-called education. This, however, didn't do him many favors in the courtroom, nor did the fact, as Elizabeth's lawyers brought forward, that Dr. Brown had lied about his identity and reasons for his visit. The whole sewing machine salesman ruse for many in the courtroom seemed a strangely underhanded and deceptive tactic by the supposedly upstanding doctor. Then, when further pressed by Elizabeth's representative, Brown would admit that on the majority of the topics they discussed that afternoon, Elizabeth had shown no signs of insanity. It was only when broaching the subject of religion that again one of Theophilus's doctors found the hint of insanity they were looking for. It was at this point that Elizabeth's lawyers cut to the heart of the matter, as they wanted to know what specifically she had said on the topic of religion that had led Brown to his diagnosis. Now, Brown's initial reply was vague, but he would eventually be pressured into admitting that he primarily based his diagnosis on her views concerning the Holy Ghost. Elizabeth, you see, was of the belief that the Trinity was representative of your prototypical family unit. So along with the father and son logic then dictated that the Holy Ghost was therefore the mother and thus female, an interpretation that Dr. Brown declared to be insane, to which Elizabeth's lawyer Stephen Moore asked if the good doctor was a theologian. When the doctor replied that he wasn't, Moore then pressed again, declaring that, quote, because the idea was a novel one to you, you pronounced her insane. Which, when put that way, doesn't sound good for the doctor who had just admitted to not being expert on the subject in question. Indeed, if anything, it seemed like Elizabeth was much more of an expert on the subject. Now, Dr. Brown wasn't quite done, as he insisted this wasn't the only reason why he found her insane. To try and recover from this unexpected blow, the doctor began reading through the notes he had taken after their meeting, in which he cited a myriad of other reasons for his diagnosis, like her rejection of the Calvinist belief that all mankind was inherently depraved, and the fact that Elizabeth considered herself to be better than her husband, which, according to the quote-unquote medical science of the day, was ludicrous, as the accepted belief was white men were the most superior creatures on the planet. Plus, as Dr. Brown pointed out, Elizabeth had a particular aversion to being called insane, which, as we all know, is a sure sign that someone must be mad, as everyone just loves being called insane. Notably, though, none of this really seemed to win the crowd in the courtroom over. It was as if none of this was, in their opinion, sufficient reason to declare a woman insane and have her locked up in an asylum. Dr. Brown, likely sensing that he was losing the crowd, then perhaps looked to impress them with a final statement replete with oversized words, as if to show off his prodigious vocabulary. A statement in which Brown declared, quote, her viewing the subject of religion from the austeric standpoint of Christian exegetical analysis and agglutinating the polysynthetical ectoplast of homogeneous aestheticism. This rambling, fairly incoherent sentence, however, did not have its intended effect, as it sent the occupants of the courtroom into fits of laughter. Suffice it to say, then, this was not a great start for Theophilus and his team, but they were far from finished, as next they called Dr. Joseph Way to the stand, with Way being the Kankakee City doctor that Theophilus recently had examine Elizabeth in his quest to obtain a second signature to have her committed again. Like the previous witnesses, then, Dr. Way would describe his examination of Elizabeth and the fact that he had found her to be quote-unquote quite sane on most subjects. However, the same, he insisted, could not be said when it came to religion, as she had, quote, some ideas that are not generally entertained. Dr. Way, however, was quick to add, quote, "Since that time I have thought perhaps I was not a proper judge," a conclusion that he might have just come to after observing Dr. Brown's testimony and the reaction he got when making similar statements, as Dr. Way would finally add that Elizabeth's beliefs were, quote, "not in accordance with my views, but that is no evidence she is insane," which is quite the change considering that he had signed off on a document declaring her insane and in need of being committed not all that long ago. With the doctors not providing the knockout blow they were hoping for, Theophilus and his lawyers switched things up. With the trial starting to focus in on Elizabeth's religious views, they decided it was time to call experts on that particular subject to the stand, starting with Deacon Abijah Dole, a high-ranking member of Theophilus's Presbyterian church, and also his brother-in-law, which is why when he took the stand, the deacon's initial focus was less on religion and instead on their personal familial connection, as he related the story of a time when he had called upon his in-laws, only to be greeted by Elizabeth, who appeared to be quite quote-unquote wild, dressed as she was in her nightclothes with her hair all over the place. This disheveled, unkempt appearance, of course, being a sign of her ill mental health. The thing was, as the deacon conveniently left out, this particular visit happened to occur during a time when her then 9-year-old daughter Libby was ill from some kind of brain fever, a disease potentially similar to the one that Elizabeth had been struck with in her youth, meaning that Elizabeth had appeared wild and disheveled not because she was insane, but because she was a mother who had just spent the entire night looking after her ailing daughter and fearing for her life. The deacon, while on the stand, even had the temerity to suggest that Elizabeth used what I can only describe as witchcraft upon her children, as he testified that when Elizabeth entered the room with her sick daughter, quote, "her influence over the child had caused the child to become deranged." It was the deacon's belief then that Elizabeth had, quote, "exerted some mesmeric or other influence over the child that caused it to moan and toss its head." Strangely enough, though, no one ever suggested that Deacon Dole needed to be examined and potentially locked away for suggesting that witchcraft was actually a thing. However, under cross-examination, the deacon was finally forced to admit the truth of the situation, that the children had been sick, and that Elizabeth had likely only appeared the way she did because she had been taking care of them. Now, this wasn't the only piece of evidence the deacon claimed to have supporting his belief that his sister-in-law was insane, as he told the court of how one time she had informed him that she could no longer live with her husband, which, according to Dole and the general wisdom of the time, was a sure sign of madness, as no wife would ever say or believe such a thing. These incidents aside, though, much of Deacon Dole's testimony would focus on the essays Elizabeth had written for the Bible class, and by extension her views on religion, as being evidence of her insanity, with the deacon asserting that, quote, "her ideas on religion did not agree with mine, nor with my views of the Bible." Yet as damning as her, in his opinion, views were, what was worse was the fact that Elizabeth had elected to leave the Presbyterian Church, as he asserted, quote, "she would not leave the church unless she was insane." For in the deacon's considered opinion, it was not, quote, "proper for persons to investigate new doctrines or systems of theology." A stunningly arrogant and stupid comment to make, considering that Deacon Dole himself had already testified on how he and Theophilus had only become Presbyterians 8 years ago after both being Congregationalists who had followed the New School Creed. Elizabeth's lawyer Stephen Moore naturally leapt upon this glaring discrepancy, as he asked the deacon, quote, "was it dangerous for you to examine the doctrines or theology embraced in the Presbyterian Church when you left the Congregational Church and joined it?" A question which Deacon Dole unsurprisingly outright refused to answer. Following this, as another deacon was given his testimony, Sybil Dole, Theophilus' younger sister, arrived to the court with Libby in tow. Yet as Sybil headed over to sit with her husband and brother, Libby broke away from her aunt, as instead of joining her father, she ran up to Elizabeth to hug and kiss her. Libby, according to Stephen Moore, then clung to her mother with, quote, "all childlike fervor." This was especially notable for Elizabeth, as this was the first real outburst of emotion and affection that her daughter had shown her since her return, as it seemed that Libby had taken to bottling up her emotion when Elizabeth had been sent away. This touching scene, however, would not be allowed to last long, as Sybil physically pulled Libby away from her mother's embrace, saying, quote, "come away from that woman, she is not fit to take care of you." An act that did nothing to endear Sybil or her family to those watching in the courtroom, as Stephen Moore would note, quote, "not a mother's heart there was but touched, and scarce a dry eye was seen." Public sentiment was quite clearly not with Theophilus at this point, and the crowd was also not particularly receptive when it was Sybil's turn to take the stand next. Ever loyal to her brother, Sybil had throughout this whole ordeal taken his side in his word concerning his wife's illness. Sybil then first focused on describing times when her sister-in-law had been upset and angry, as women of that era were expected to be prim and proper, loving and caring at all times. Any signs of ill temper then were supposedly signs of insanity. For example, she told of how outraged Elizabeth had been when Sybil had taken in her young son Arthur prior to her being committed, a move that had obviously been a part of Theophilus's plan to isolate his wife from their children to make it easier to take her away. Sybil would then describe Elizabeth as appearing very wild at this time, as she had been, quote, filled with spite toward Mr. Packard. Because why would she ever be upset with the man who was taking her children away from her in apparent preparation to having her locked up in the insane asylum? Indeed, Sybil would also relate to the court a time when she had witnessed Sybil getting quite upset with her husband just because he had called her mad. Then there was the time, according to Sybil, that Theophilus brought home some unexpected guests. At this, Elizabeth, since she did not have any bread prepared, instead made biscuits to have with dinner, an event that Sybil seemed to believe was a sure sign of her sister-in-law's insanity. I mean, surely you see the connection here. A woman did not have enough bread ready for dinner for unexpected company, and thus made biscuits. She must be mad. Thankfully, though, the ludicrousness of this statement was not lost on the crowd, as one man from the back of the courtroom in response was said to have called out, quote, "Wife, were you ever out of bread and had to make biscuit for dinner? I must put you in an insane asylum, no mistake." Seemingly then, no one was taking this latest bit of evidence seriously. Still, Theophilus and his team kept at it, as they called several of his former parishioners to the stand to testify on how they felt Elizabeth and her views to have been dangerous to the church, which was why they had signed off on the petition to have her sent away. Then, following these witnesses, Theophilus's legal team surprisingly asked the court to recess for 10 days, until their next witness, the highly respected Dr. Andrew McFarland, could arrive and give his testimony. Elizabeth's team naturally and immediately protested this unusual and prolonged adjournment. Instead, they offered the court a deal. They were willing to submit the case for judgment immediately without ever calling a witness of their own. Seemingly confident that none of the witnesses Theophilus's team had called had been at all helpful to their case. It was then Theophilus's team's turn to object and offer their own deal. This one being that instead of waiting to put Dr. McFarland himself on the stand, they would simply settle on reading the certificate of insanity that he had signed for Elizabeth and a piece of recent correspondence between himself and Mr. Packard. A letter in which the doctor had asserted that he had no question as to Elizabeth's insanity, and how he and the other officers of the asylum had declared her insanity incurable. This, you have to understand, was very much not good for Elizabeth and her team, as no matter how she personally felt about McFarland and the way he ran his asylum, the fact remained that he was still a nationally renowned superintendent of the state hospital. In fact, if anything, having these statements read into evidence was worse than allowing McFarland himself to take the stand, as while he had proven himself to be quite capable of being deceptive in his dealings with Elizabeth, having him there would have at least allowed her attorneys the opportunity to cross-examine him like they had the other doctors and potentially poke holes in his testimony. As it was, though, his authoritative declarations were just read into evidence before the jury without any way for Elizabeth's representatives to push back. With this, Theophilus's team finally seemed to have the upper hand, and thus they rested their case. Which meant, in contrast to their earlier suggestion, Elizabeth's team now to present their side in an effort to undo the damage done by McFarland's documentation. Among those now called to the stand was one Dr. Mann, who, like the other doctors before him, had examined Elizabeth at her husband's request. Unlike the others, however, Dr. Mann had examined Elizabeth not just once but twice, and both times he had refused to declare her insane. Also called to the stand were Methodist minister Isaac Symington and local postmaster, justice of the peace, and notary public Joseph Labrie. Both men would then testify to knowing Elizabeth and not once ever thinking her anything but sane. Indeed, Labrie, when cross-examined, would make sure to note for the court that as a notary public, he had witnessed just 2 months prior how Theophilus had Elizabeth sign off on some real estate deeds, which would have been an extremely odd thing for Theophilus to do if he honestly believed his wife to be insane. Also taking the stand on behalf of Elizabeth were her friends Debbie Hanford and Rebecca Blessing, who would testify about the events of the 9th of January, the one day they had actually been allowed to visit Elizabeth since Theophilus had imprisoned her again. During this time, the entire state of Illinois was experiencing a stretch of extremely cold weather. There was snow piled up 10 feet high in places, and on some days the temperatures were as low as 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, conditions that had pretty much put a stop to any kind of outdoor activities due to the fear of frostbite. Elizabeth's friends then were understandably quite shocked when they found her locked in the nursery with no fire lit therein to keep her warm. A story which did a great job of illustrating just how cruel and heartless Theophilus was, but the fear among Elizabeth's team of lawyers was they had yet to really do anything to counter the impact of Dr. McFarland's statements, so their next move was to cut straight to the heart of the issue. They wanted to present to the court an example of the actual document/oration that had given birth to all the accusations of Elizabeth's madness. They then wanted to share with the court one of Elizabeth's controversial Bible essays. Now, Theophilus had confiscated the offending documents from her years ago, but strangely enough he had held onto them even though he steadfastly refused to return them. Until, that is, shortly before this all came to a head, when Elizabeth proposed to make a deal with him. Elizabeth, you see, had been given some real estate by her father that Theophilus had been trying to sell for some time. He had been unable to do so, however, because he legally needed Elizabeth to sign off on the deal, and she obviously had no interest in doing him any favors. That is, until just a few weeks before this when Elizabeth offered to sign off on the deal provided he return her essays. For Theophilus, who saw no value in these documents, this was a no-brainer. For Elizabeth, though, who was already planning on bringing this issue to the courtroom, these essays were proof that she wasn't insane and never had been. They were, after all, the reason why Theophilus had first asserted she was insane and threatened to have her institutionalized. Therefore, if she could share them and show there was nothing in them that showed she was insane, she would have then effectively undermined her husband's entire case. Indeed, several of Theophilus's own witnesses had pointed to those very essays as being the reason why they believed her to be insane. So, after getting Theophilus himself to reluctantly admit that the document in question was indeed one of the offending essays, Elizabeth's team asked the court's permission to have Elizabeth herself read one out to the jury, believing that once the jury got to hear the intelligent and charismatic woman herself read her own words, the accusation of her insanity would ring incredibly false to their ears. With the judge's permission, then, Elizabeth rose to her feet and began addressing the court. The room was said to be utterly silent as Elizabeth began, with everyone in attendance listening intently as they wanted to hear this for themselves. This was, after all, the allegedly insane woman speaking for herself as she read the words that had supposedly proved her insanity. Plus, this was also a fairly unique scene, because as I talked about in my episode on spiritualism, women at this time typically did not speak in public, so this was quite rare and unusual even regardless of the greater context. Elizabeth would specifically read from an essay in which she had addressed the question on whether a devout individual should expect more success than a sinner, a question which Theophilus and his church had answered yes they should, an idea that Elizabeth disagreed with. If anyone in the courtroom was expecting the ravings of a madwoman, they were then sorely disappointed when Elizabeth instead delivered a well-reasoned and thought-out argument that one should not expect material rewards for piety, as she would argue that a number of factors go into how productive and successful people are and how much money they make. For example, she would explain, quote, "A very immoral man may be a very healthy, long-lived man. For, notwithstanding he violate the moral department, he may live in conformity to the physical laws of his animal nature, which secure him his physical health." Meaning that someone might be a depraved sinner according to the Bible, but if they eat right and exercise, they would still be healthy regardless. In contrast, quote, "On the other hand, a very moral man may suffer greatly from a diseased body, and be cut off in the midst of his usefulness by an early death in consequence of having violated the physical laws of his animal constitution." In other words, someone might be incredibly pious, but if they neglect their health, they could still be struck down by disease or death. According to Elizabeth in her essay, then, quote, "Our success in business depends upon our conformity to those laws on which success depends, not upon the motives which act only on the moral plane. On this ground, the Christian farmer has no more reason to expect success in his farming operations than the penitent sinner. In either case, the foundation for success must depend on the degree of fidelity with which the natural laws are applied. which caused a natural result, not upon the motives of the operator, since these moral acts receive their penalty and reward on an entirely different plane of his being. Basically, Elizabeth's argument was a pious man should not expect to be rewarded for his piety in this world but in the next. Again, then, nothing she was saying was outrageous. If anything, her arguments seemed rooted in common sense, and which were all delivered by the charismatic woman in such a way that when she came to the end, the crowd in the courtroom actually erupted in applause. The opinion of those in the audience then was decidedly on Elizabeth's side once again. Annie, who had potentially been swayed by McFarlane's expertise, now seemingly could not ignore the evidence of their own eyes and ears. It seemed clear to all then that the woman who had just spoken before them was anything but insane. Indeed, the very idea that such an oration had been used as evidence of her insanity seemed laughable. The mood was such following Elizabeth's speech that the Dulles and Theophilus actually feared a bit for their own safety due to the rising hostility of the crowd, who were increasingly outraged at the things these people had done to the clearly sane Elizabeth. The thing was, even though they had seemingly won over the people who had come to see the trial, there was still no guarantee that the members of the jury themselves were similarly convinced. So Elizabeth's team pressed on the following day when they called to the stand Dr. Alexander Duncanson. Duncanson was a medical doctor and theologian with degrees in both from Scottish universities, since which time he had been a practicing physician for 2 decades, as well as serving as a pastor who had formerly broken with the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. In other words, he was kind of the ideal person to speak on this case, that was focused on the medical diagnosis of insanity and religious matters. Indeed, Stephen Moore, knowing of the doctor/clergyman who actually resided in Kankakee, had made a point of reaching out to Dr. Duncanson as the trial got underway to ask him to examine and interview Elizabeth. As they called him to the stand now then, Dr. Duncanson was there to act as the expert counter to Dr. McFarlane's statements. Duncanson would then testify that in his professional opinion, after speaking with Elizabeth for some 3 hours on politics, religion, and science, quote, "I think not only is she sane, but the most intelligent lady I have talked with in many years." Indeed, after their conversation, the doctor found Elizabeth to have been quite well versed and able to discuss whatever topic he brought up. In particular, according to Duncanson, he found Elizabeth well versed in both the new and old school doctrines. As for the various unusual or unconventional beliefs that she held, well, according to Dr. Duncanson, who was an actual expert on the subject, unlike literally everyone else who had testified, quote, "Many of her ideas and doctrines are embraced in Swedenborgianism, and many are found only in the New School theology. The best and most learned men of both Europe and this country are advocates of these doctrines." In particular, multiple witnesses for Theophilus had called attention to Elizabeth speaking of the Holy Ghost as being female, with several of the doctors even giving this belief as an example of her insanity. According to Dr. Duncanson, however, an actual expert on such matters, this was not an entirely uncommon interpretation. Indeed, it was actually quite ancient in origin, and had actually been used and considered by a number of prominent figures over the centuries. Now, that's not to say Duncanson agreed with Elizabeth's interpretation. However, unlike the witnesses for Theophilus, the doctor would declare, quote, "I did not agree with her in sentiment on many things, but I do not call people insane because they differ from me." Ultimately, Dr. Duncanson would assert that he found none of the indications of insanity as laid out in all the books he had studied on the matter. Indeed, the doctor would loudly announce to the court, quote, "I pronounce her a sane woman, and wish we had a nation of such women." It was then with this pronouncement that Stephen Moore rested his case. The question of Elizabeth's sanity, and whether or not she would be doomed to life in an asylum, was then in the hands of the jury, and what they would decide was at that moment anyone's guess. Deciding her fate were 12 men, as women were not allowed to sit on juries, who came from occupations like shoemaker, architect, the owner of a stable, and the owner of a saloon. Also within their ranks were 5 Presbyterians, which is notable as they shared the same religion as Theophilus, while the rest of the jurors were from various other denominations. The jury in the end would take all of 7 minutes to come to a conclusion following a trial that had lasted for 5 days. Whether this quick turnaround was good news or not for Elizabeth, no one could say. That is, until the jury foreman read their verdict aloud, quote, "We, the undersigned jurors in the case of Mrs. Elizabeth P.W. Packard, alleged to be insane, having heard the evidence in the case, are satisfied that said Elizabeth P.W. Packard is sane." At this, the crowd in the courtroom celebrated, cheering and pressing forward in their excitement. It then actually took quite some time and effort for Judge Starr to bring quiet back to the courtroom so he could formally announce, quote, "It is hereby ordered that Mrs. Elizabeth P.W. Packard be relieved of all restraints incompatible with her condition as a sane woman." Elizabeth Packard had won a great victory. A court had, at last, officially declared her sane, finally giving voice to the lie that her husband had begun spreading all those years ago. Yet, as great as this victory was, it was still only a partial victory, a fact made most clear when even before leaving the courtroom, Elizabeth was handed a letter that had been sent to her by her husband, a letter in which Theophilus informed her that he had left for Massachusetts with their children because he feared for his own safety. Theophilus, you see, continued to see himself as a victim in all things. In particular, he now saw himself as a victim of a prejudiced sham trial that was being influenced by the mob of people in attendance who definitely did not seem to like him very much. To that end, as Theophilus would note in his own journal, quote, "I withdrew from the monocratic court before the last day of the trial, and on Monday, January 18th, took 2 of my young children and went to South Deerfield, Massachusetts." A fact which he revealed in this letter, along with an invitation for Elizabeth to come and join them, which largely seems to have been Theophilus's way of protecting himself against being sued for desertion, as he had to have known how unlikely it was she would ever willingly put herself at his mercy ever again. As for Elizabeth, upon receiving this letter, she and her friends immediately set off for Manteno riding hard. Yet, when they arrived at her home, they found it already occupied by a renter, with everything she had owned gone, along with, most importantly, her children. Elizabeth Packard then, according to the court, was officially sane. Yet here she was at 42 years old, deprived of her children, without a cent or belonging to her name, and with no home. After all, by law, everything that Elizabeth had owned legally belonged to her husband, since married women had no right to their own property or even their own wages. Indeed, in many states, married women and insane patients actually had more or less the same legal rights. So, while Elizabeth was officially sane according to the courts, her actual legal situation had not really changed all that much. It was then for this reason that there was nothing Elizabeth could legally do to get her children back. Elizabeth's fight then was far from over. However, this episode is. So Elizabeth fights to get her children back, to protect those unfortunate souls still locked away in asylums, and to change the law so no other woman would have to go through what she did, will have to, for now, remain a story for another time.
Thank you for listening to Distorted History. If you would like to help out, please rate and review the podcast and tell your friends if you think they'll be interested. If you're feeling especially generous and would like to help keep this podcast going, please consider visiting my Ko-fi page at ko-fi.com/distortedhistory and donating a few bucks. Anything you can give is greatly appreciated. I will be posting updates on future episodes and sources there in addition to posting them on Twitter as I usually do. With all that being said, once again, thank you for listening, and until next time.